Thank you, Speaker. My question is for the Premier. Premier, last week in a landmark case, the federal court ruled that native forest logging in Victoria is not complying with the rules put in place to protect our threatened species, like the endangered greater glider and leadbeater's possum. In fact, the government's logging agency here in Victoria is breaking the law and therefore will no longer be exempt from federal environment laws. Premier, it seems pretty clear after this ruling that native logging in Victoria is simply no longer tenable. So will the government now bring forward the transition out of native forest logging so that workers in industry can receive transition payments now and logging can cease now rather than in 5 or 10 years?
Call the Premier.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I thank the member for Melbourne for her question. And I am aware of the judgment that she raises in her question. What I would simply say is this: the government has outlined its timeline for a staged transition to end native timber harvesting. We believe that this industry is not sustainable into the medium and long term. We believe that it is not appropriate to simply ignore that fact and then have this industry collapse. There will be many more job losses than a managed transition. Now, I accept not every Victorian agrees with that position. I accept that I accept that not every Victorian, including the member for Narrabeen, do not necessarily agree with the policy decision that the government has made. I would have thought we could have a civil debate about this. That's what I'm certainly interested in doing. I accept the passion with which the member for Melbourne approaches this subject. But what I would say to her is this: the government has laid out a fully funded, fully costed plan. It will involve pain, it will involve transition, but it is far better than the alternative, which is to simply allow this industry to die over a long period of time without the transition to other employment, without the transition to support every worker, every business and every community for whom native timber harvesting is a significant industry. That is not our approach. However, whilst I'm urged by the member for Melbourne to bring forward the timetable, I cannot make those announcements. I cannot agree to that. What I can say to the member for Melbourne, though, as a matter of fact, the environmental regulator, the conservation regulator, together with Vic Forests, are still making assessments. And this might be frustrating for some of those bushfire-affected communities and the timber industry, but though the assessments as to the damage done by both the bushfires and indeed what, if any, impact the global pandemic has had on this industry, those assessments are still being made, and I have no policy changes to announce to the member for Melbourne, but I do make the point those assessments are still being made. If I can furnish the member for Melbourne with any additional information after question time, I'm more than happy to do that in relation to the judgment. But again, we've laid out a clear plan. I have no announcements to make about changing it. And I do accept this is an emotional issue. It's a very practical issue as well, no matter what perspective you come to this issue from. But we think we've got the balance right, and that's evidenced by the fact that some are urging us to do less, some are urging us to do more. I think that's usually a good proxy for having got the balance right.
Member for Melbourne on a supplementary.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Premier. The Premier mentions that logging is not sustainable into the future, but it's not just unsustainable in the long term, it's actually not sustainable in the immediate term because it has in fact been found to be illegal. So will the government put an immediate moratorium on native forest logging across Victoria until the full implications of this court decision are assessed, or will illegal logging continue with the support of this Labor government?
Premier.
Well, thank you, Speaker, and I thank the member for Melbourne for her supplementary question. I suppose I would take a different view in that this is not quite as binary, quite as black and white as the member for Melbourne would seize it, and she's entitled to her view, but I don't necessarily agree with that view, nor would I accept ever that the government has policy responses that are against the law. That's not the government's position on any matter. There has been a judgment. The exact status of that judgment in terms of appeals and things of that nature, I'll come back to the member on that front. But there are a lot of planned logging that ought to be occurring right now is not occurring because impacts of the bushfires have not yet been assessed. We've always said, as to the sustainability or otherwise of this industry, one really significant fire event would be the difference, or at least could be. And I think, sadly, that's what we are seeing. That's what we are seeing. We have a plan, and we have no change to that plan to announce today or any day.